welcome to Let's Talk, a podcast series produced by Hazelden Betty Ford. I'm your host, William C. Moyers. Over the years, I've interviewed many colleagues, and often I hear their deeply personal stories of how they turned their own struggle and addiction into a life of recovery, and with it, a career helping other people recover. It is rare, actually, to hear a colleague share their story that is forged from the loss, heartache, and trauma that follows the death of a loved one from alcoholism or drug addiction. As too many families know, death is the only real bottom for people suffering with this chronic illness. It happens all the time, too. A tragic story told by too many families, year after year after decade. Dr. Sara Polley is the medical director of Hazelden Betty Ford's National Substance Use and Mental Health Treatment Center for Adolescents and Young Adults in suburban Minneapolis. She is board certified in adult psychiatry, child and adolescent psychiatry, and addiction medicine. She joined Hazelden Betty Ford earlier in 2021. Thank you, Dr. Polley, for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Tell us your family's story.
Yeah, I would love to. I grew up here in Minnesota, just in suburbs south of the Twin Cities. And we were kind of an average middle-class family growing up. My dad had struggled with alcoholism before I was born. And then when I was born, actually ended up having a car accident when I was pretty young, I think secondary to his alcohol use, and then actually entered a period of sobriety for a long time. He was an AA participant, really found meaning in that, and was, and then I ended up having two more brothers, and my family was kind of plugging along, just doing our thing. And then, unfortunately, when I was 11, I had my younger brother, who was 8, pass away suddenly. It's actually a very sad story. We were on vacation, and he drowned in the swimming pool at the vacation, which was really unexpected, as you can imagine, and really traumatic for my family. As a result of that, I think my parents really struggled. And at the time, just being a kid, I knew that our lives would always be different after that, and I knew that my parents were having a hard time. But, like a lot of people in my family, you didn't really go see a therapist, you didn't go see a psychiatrist, you just sort of prayed about it and relied on your family and tried to keep going forward. And so, I could see that both my parents really struggled. And then it was, I don't know how much after that my dad relapsed on alcohol. And looking back, my parents and my dad worked really, really hard at trying to find the best treatment. Like I remember him, things would get bad, he would, be willing to have some help. They would go, I think they went to see a naturopath for a while, and he was taking supplements. He tried to go back to AA. My mom's father's actually, prior to him passing away, was in recovery from alcoholism for 30 years. And so he tried to help my dad, take him to meetings. He got a sponsor. And there were a lot of periods there where he would be doing really well. He was the breadwinner for our family. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. So, I was looking back, it's through all of that, he kept a full-time job. He, supported our family, would go, sometimes had to go to detox or something would happen, and he would, get picked up and then have to go to detox and then come home and be right up ready to go to work the next day after he had gotten home, because he knew that that's what he had to do for our family. And then when I was in college, he had gotten pretty ill and had been kind of going to detoxes, coming home, and I think was feeling really hopeless. And I, felt like nothing was working. And I was at college. I was I think it was September 4th, because it was the very first day of us being in our new apartments at college, and I had just moved in, and I was really excited, and got a phone call from my aunt, actually, that said, your mom and I are driving up to campus. Are you at the apartments? And I said, yeah, I'm at the apartments. They said, okay, well, we'll be there in about 20 minutes. And my first thought actually was, I bet my dad died. That,
You just knew it.
Yeah, because I think he had been struggling for so long that it seemed like there was not going to be another outcome, really. I mean, because I couldn't see how else it was going to end because of how sick he was. And of course, I didn't hope that would happen. I hoped that, well, maybe he'll go back to inpatient, maybe, one of these times it's going to work, or maybe something will happen and he'll, have a spiritual experience and then feel really motivated or something. But so I actually remember I was outside in the back of the apartment building I was living in at a picnic table, like waiting for them to show up. And they showed up in my aunt's car, and my mom came over and told me that my dad had died. And like I said, I don't think I was super surprised. And, I think a lot of families that have a family member who struggles with addiction, when that person passes away, they feel a lot of relief. And I remember feeling a lot of relief.
Really?
Yeah, and I think, partially because he didn't have to suffer anymore, because it really was truly suffering in the same way that you might see a parent suffer from something like cancer or heart disease. I mean, trying the treatments, them not working, it was really isolating to be the child of somebody that's struggling, because you don't share with your friends. You don't talk about it. People wonder, why isn't your dad here? Where's your dad? But you don't really, oh no, he's busy, or you don't really want to talk about it. So I felt like, well, that piece is going to be gone. I don't have to try to pretend like everything's normal at my house and with my family. So I think, yeah, and he passed away really suddenly, even though I sort of wasn't surprised. He had been in an inpatient treatment and then had come home, and then actually ended up having a heart attack while he was having a withdrawal seizure. Yeah.
Sarah, how old was he?
He was 47.
And what was his name?
Steve.
Steve.
Yeah.
47, so young.
Yeah.
So young. How do you remember his addiction when you were little? Did you all talk about it when openly talk about it, or was it sort of the worst kept secret, or how did it manifest itself when you were little?
Yeah. Well, it was interesting because I think, since my dad had been involved in AA and my mom had gone to Al-Anon, I think, my mom and our family worked to try to talk about it. But it was really just within our nuclear family. It was definitely this message of, well, we talk about it, but we just don't talk about it with our neighbors or your friends. We sometimes would talk about it with our extended family, but often not unless it was a crisis and we needed help.
Oftentimes we have, stories of hope, and we highlight the power of recovery, whether it's at Hazelden Betty Ford or at the Salvation Army or another treatment facility. But we do know the outcome with this illness can be what happened to your dad. What is the message that you want our viewers and listeners to know about your dad's struggle and ultimately his death?
Well, I guess when I think about what I would like people to know is that I don't think that and really anyone who has a family member who's struggling who may pass away, I'd like to think that the reason that I am where I am is because of him. And so, even just driving here to do this interview, I was thinking about him and thinking about him being with me while I was talking to you. And, my goal in sharing this story is I want other kids who I know are in that situation to know that they can use that experience to provide a sense of purpose for them. And, when I show up to work every day, when I was in medical school, when I was studying for my board exams, when I was doing all the things I needed to do, I knew I was doing it because I wanted to do it for my dad. Yes. And I wanted to be able to share my experience. And, because when you go through something like that, whether it's your personal story or a family member, I think there's a certain kind of insight and empathy that you can have for others that I think if you haven't been through something like that, you can, of course, love others and care about others, but I don't think you can quite understand. And so, I remember thinking when I was in college and this happened, at first it's like, well, this is awful, nothing good is going to come from this. And then kind of over time, as you kind of move through the grief process, coming to the realization that this can be a super powerful thing that I can use to help other people.
Yes. I want to come back to that in just a minute, but let me ask you, how did you recover? I mean, because I oftentimes, particularly with the opioid epidemic, I would say to families who've lost a loved one, now, you've got to take care of yourself. And they say, well, why? I mean, our loved one is gone. It doesn't matter anymore. But it does matter. So how did you do it?
Yeah. No, that's a really wonderful point to bring up, because I think, that initial relief feeling when you have a loved one that passes away that's been suffering is, oh, good, now my life can go back to being normal and I don't have to have addiction be a part of my life anymore. And it's, and I think there's probably a period where that feels like it's true.
Right.
And then over time you realize that, you've been impacted by the trauma that you've been through, and you can't, you could just kind of plug along and not really try to think about it or deal with it, but you're really going to be inhibiting yourself from being able to be who you really are. And so, it's through a lot of therapy work, it's through, allowing yourself to move through the stages of grief and understanding that it doesn't always make sense, and coming to the realization that, yeah, sometimes I'm going to hear a stupid song on the radio and I'm going to start crying on my way home from work, even though he's been dead for a long time, and not like beat myself up about that's just part of what it is. But yeah, but you're right. I think that's a really important point about it, is that there is this kind of desire to just like go back to normal. And you're not going to do yourself justice if you do that, right? Like, you deserve it to yourself to put some work in, to come out the other side being a better and more powerful person.
And in your case, you took the adversity of your loss, the challenge that you had with trauma. You were a young woman at the time. You took that adversity, that loss, and you turned it into the opportunity to do what you're doing today. How has your personal experience informed and helped you to be a better doctor?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that came to my mind when you said that was that just the process of being with a person who's struggling and being able to sit with them and hold the situation and tolerate the situation is something that I think I bring to working with patients. I remember when I was back in training, you would have a patient who struggled with addiction or with mental illness, and some of the stories they would tell are just tragic and hard to understand. And I remember I would sort of be sitting there like, no, I get it. Like, I've seen chaos like that. I've seen struggle like that. I've seen what that looks like. And so to me, it wasn't sort of shocking or overwhelming like I think it could be. It was sort of like, no, I get it. I get what you're saying. I could identify with that kind of situation and how difficult that can get. And so I think that's something that, I don't necessarily say to my patient, like, oh, I know what that's like, or I see that. But I think that you don't necessarily need to say that. I think people sense that, right? Like, when I'm sitting with somebody and I'm holding that situation and that emotion and that story with them, that they can sense that to me it's okay and it's not a big deal. And I'm not looking at them like something's wrong with them or that they're somehow messed up. That's not the perspective I'm taking. And I think people can just feel that. I don't need to say that. And so that's a big piece, I think, of what I bring to kind of the relationships that I form with my patients.
And yet in the medical profession, no matter where we are in the medical profession, in our case, in the field of addiction treatment and recovery, professional boundaries are professional boundaries. Doctors and nurses and other healthcare workers are encouraged to keep that boundary. How does that work for you?
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, I think that really goes back to what I was just saying, I'm a trained psychiatrist, and so that's a huge part of our training is maintaining boundaries with your patients, right? Because you can become very intimate with your patients, and so it's very important that the relationship stays for the benefit of the patient. It is not my relationship that I'm benefiting off of, it's really the one for my patient. And we're always trained to really be aware of that and focus on that. So, I would say I can't even think of a single patient that I have that necessarily knows that that's my personal story now, unless they were to find it online or something like that. But like I said, I almost think that it's not relevant that I have to say anything. I think I can provide, compassionate, evidence-based care to my patients, and there's just this feeling in the room when we're together that I think this person gets it. I think this person isn't being judgmental of me, because there's so much to communication and connection that isn't what you say, right? And so I think that there is something that's being communicated, even though I'm still, doing perfectly fine maintaining my boundary. I'm not oversharing my experience. So
your focus is on addiction medicine and young people. Why?
Oh, I love working with that age group. It's my absolute favorite. I think it's such a cool, exciting time. And part of that, I think, is from my own experience, right? Because, I was kind of emerging out of this family that had its own struggles. I was able to go to college. Thankfully, I was fortunate enough, right, to live on campus. And I felt like I was almost like, not to be cheesy, but like a butterfly, like coming out, right? Like I could figure out who I was. I could shed kind of some of the dysfunction that I had been in. I could invent who I wanted to be. I could use my experiences and make my own decisions. And so, I love working with patients who are right on that cusp, right? Where maybe what they're coming from is something challenging or dysfunctional, and they don't have to continue that cycle. They have the autonomy and the ability, and most of the time, the patients I work with are the most amazingly resilient people I've ever met.
Yes.
They can do that if they want to do that, and sometimes they just don't know, or they forget, or everyone else hasn't told them that, right? Like they've gotten messages that they messed up, or you're just going to be like your, XYZ other family member that struggled. So to be able to be somebody different in their life that can say like, oh my God, cool, look at you. Like, look what you're going to be able to do with yourself. So, I mean, from a psychological perspective, I think that's a big piece. And then, from a biologic perspective, the brain is still amazingly capable of change when you're a teen and a young adult. And so I just earlier today was telling a patient this, that was like, how cool is that if you get this figured out right now, your brain could potentially not have any long-term impacts from the substances you were using, or from the trauma that you've experienced. We could get you to a place where you're going to have an awesome life, and this isn't going to have to be something you carry around with you, because your brain is actually capable of doing that right now. And how awesome is it that you got here when you were 20 and we still have time, versus a patient coming in when they're older. It's not that it can't happen, it just takes a lot of work. So yes, I love working with young people.
Well, I often tell young people that I'm not a clinician, believe me, but when people ask me for help and they're lamenting that they have to go to treatment at 18 or 20, I say, are you kidding? You're so lucky to be able to start down that road to recovery now. I wasted half my teens, all of my 20s, and half of my 30s before I finally found recovery. So I know it is. I know it's hard to go to treatment when you're a young person, but on the other hand, you get to start over, and do that. I want to come back to your personal story, because this is a story of hope.
Yeah.
Tell us, how has your family continued to recover in those years since your dad died?
Yeah. Well, I think it's been a different journey for each of us, right? I think. I have a brother, my brother who's living, who's in his early 30s, and I think, when my dad passed away, he was younger, and so I think he was just impacted in different ways than I was, and also being a son and having your dad pass away, I think is also a little bit different. So, I think it took him a little bit longer to get through college than, probably what he would have naturally been. I mean, he's a really, really intelligent guy. He's actually a mechanical engineer now. But, I think his path just maybe took a little bit longer.
Of course. What is the final message with our last minute or so that we have? Here you are sharing yourself on one of our podcasts that'll be seen, not just within the Hazelden Betty Ford family, not just in the addiction community or the recovery community, but to whomever wants to go out to YouTube or all those other sources. And you are standing up and speaking out and putting an accurate face on the power of addiction and also the promise and possibility of recovery. What is the message you want to leave with our viewers and listeners?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. I think the main message I want to leave with people is that if you're somebody who's in a situation where you're really struggling, or you have a family member that's struggling, that's not the end of the story. I mean, you have the ability, and like I said, when you go through difficult things, you have a special, almost like a superpower, I think, that you can use for whatever purpose you want to use it for. You can use it for good, you can use it to help others, and so you have the opportunity to move forward and step forward and kind of create your own journey, and so it is really it can be a really hopeful thing. You can emerge out of the really difficult struggle. I guess is the main message I would want to tell people, is that you can have hope, and it is a reason to be hopeful.
And you're living that message today, and we're so grateful that you have brought that message to us and used your own experience to empower other people to find that hope and that help and that healing. Dr. Sara Polley, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all for joining us. Remember, addiction is an illness that does not discriminate, but treatment works and recovery is possible. So if you or a loved one are struggling with a substance use issue, don't wait, reach out and ask for help, because treatment works and recovery is possible. I'm your host, William C. Moyers. I hope you'll join us for another edition of Let's Talk. See you soon.